The seeds we use today are a lot weaker than you'd expect. Even our heirloom and organic seeds, despite seeming like the gold standard for what we should be planting, don't have the vigor they once did. And a lot of that has to do with how we relate to seeds. Let me explain. Seeds used to be a daily part of most people's lives. Saving seeds was essential for survival, and people felt that, because healthy seeds meant healthy society. Everyone from farmers to kings understood that seeds were a cultural treasure to be respected and tended to with as much care and importance as they could manage. Seeds became a sacred commitment. And the benefit of relating to seeds like that is that today we have something that makes civilization possible. The staples of our diet. They all come out of that process. All the veggies and grains we eat, the corn that's been selected over 8,000 years from an inedible weed into the abundant ears we have the privilege of eating today. The hundreds of different varieties of edible species and tens of thousands of varieties, they all came out of that close relationship we had with seeds, where we were gradually selecting, strengthening, and improving the quality of those seeds. And yet today, in day-to-day life, we kind of forget that seeds are a thing. Most of us have distanced ourselves enough that I'd go so far as to say that we live in a seedless society. Which might seem like a weird thing to say since you find seeds all over the place. But what I mean when I say seedless is that the vast majority of us don't make any place for seeds in our life. We don't interact with them in any real way. We don't think about them. We definitely don't thank them for anything. There's no more of that sacred commitment. We're actively trying to get rid of them from our agriculture, our gardens, parks, and yards, and when we do interact with them, it's only as a means to an end to get our food. And that might be forgivable if the results were healthier or better food, or richer, wilder ecosystems, or a healthier planet, or even healthier people, but it's none of those things. Our seeds are getting weaker. All we've really got to show for it is more food. Because yeah, our seeds produce a lot more than they used to, which sounds great, but if you start to look closer, what you find is that what's happening is that even though we've got more food, it's less nutritious. That the seeds we're using in most cases are getting less resistant to disease, less capable of responding to ecologic changes, and the result is that they end up harming the world. So let's talk about seeds. What have we done that's weakened them? What effects has that had on us? And what can we do to strengthen our seeds? Really quick, this is the seed cycle we all learned as kids. You start with seeds, plant them in the ground, they grow, flower, eventually they get pollinated, and in the process they might evolve or adapt. Then they develop new seeds, and finally we harvest those seeds and restart the cycle. Simple. Unfortunately, that isn't really how that cycle goes anymore. And we'll get into the specifics of why that is a bit later on, but for now, to understand how we got here, I think it's really important to take a look at the last 100 or so years in the history of seed. You might be surprised to find out that in America, during more or less the first half of the 1900s, there was somewhat of a golden age of seed breeding. You had a few things all happening at the same time. First, you had what were then the recent genetic discoveries of inheritance, really starting to become widespread. You had large research institutions beginning to use those genetic discoveries to breed new varieties. You had the Department of Agriculture in America reproducing the best seed varieties they could find, and then distributing millions and millions of seed packets to farmers for free. And at the same time, you had hundreds and maybe thousands of small seed companies all around the country, who each individually were breeding and selecting new and improved seed varieties uniquely adapted to the needs of their local farmers. And keep in mind, these seed companies could only stay in business if they were breeding seeds that were better than the seeds individual farmers were saving for themselves or receiving for free from the government. And finally, we didn't have the arsenal of agrochemicals we do today. Every farmer had to take the fertility of their farm more or less as it was, which meant that one of the most important bottlenecks for growing food was the ability to adapt your seed to the quality of your land. So seeds became hyper-local and were much more capable of growing in all kinds of difficult terrain. If you lived in a desert, you'd have seeds selected for drought tolerance, and if you lived in floodplains, you'd have seeds selected for resistance to floods, for example. Seeds were a reflection of the environments in which they grew. But as is usually the case, the Green Revolution changed that. Farming was transformed, and our priorities for seeds shifted. By the 1950s and 60s, a lot of those breeders were starting to go out of business because, for most people, developing new seeds stopped being profitable. Instead of those workhorse-type seeds spread out around the country, each adapted to local conditions, what we saw develop was a single type of seed that could be planted almost everywhere. And just like that, breeding new seeds for the vast majority of people became basically a thing of the past. And since farmers were getting such impressive yields, no one really minded or gave it a second thought. But there was a hidden price to that. In those 50 or so years before the Green Revolution, breeding had passed from the average farmer to the professional breeder. And then the Green Revolution centralized breeding even further so that suddenly there were only a few elite breeders left, which meant that in the span of just a few generations, we'd gone from knowing how to care for seeds being common knowledge to there being almost no one left who knew anything about them at all. What made the situation worse was that the breeders who were left stopped selecting for things like vitality, resilience, and regionality. Instead, they were selecting for yield and uniformity. They stopped caring about a seed's resistance to disease because they realized that they didn't need to worry about anything as dull as the environment where you grew your seeds. With all our new technology, we could basically make every agricultural field have ideal growing conditions. And just like that, everything flipped. The thinking became, why waste time trying to keep these genetic traits for resistance to fungal disease if I can just inundate the field with fungicide? Why worry about drought if I can just dig a well? And where that left us, at the tail end of this little corner of history, is locked in a downward spiral, where the seeds available to us force us to farm in a particular way that harms ecosystems. Then farmers are pushed to erode soils and exclude wildlife, and expend ridiculous amounts of energy to keep it all running to be able to shape the entire world to make up for what those seeds can no longer do for themselves. So, confronted with the weakening state of our seeds, what did seed breeders do to respond to that? Did they start selecting seeds to return the lost resilience and begin to sell stronger seeds? A bit, but mostly what they did was double down on the previous strategies of selecting for a few profitable traits to the ecological detriment of most everything else. And once they had those seeds they wanted, policed the purity of that seed to ensure that they would never change, and no one would have the capacity to do anything about it. At a certain point, breeders realized that evolution and adaptation in seeds weren't things that were helping farmers. They were problems standing in the way of profitability. Because every new trait or cross between varieties is a potential problem. It doesn't matter if those new traits are positive or negative. It doesn't matter if the new seed leads to better yields or more resilience to disease. What matters is that those new traits can introduce complications into the farming process and make it less predictable. Because it's nice that those crosses might yield better crops, but if they also happen to ripen later than the rest of the field, well, now you've got to make several passes, which costs more, or harvest some of your crop green, which means it can't be sold. And those are the real problems that affect a farmer's bottom line. So what was most important to these breeders was that every seed behave exactly like every other seed. What mattered was purity and uniformity of the seed. And there's been a lot of strategies invented to make sure that seeds stay pure. Some seeds have been inbred to the point that even though the seed you buy grows well and uniform, any seed you might save from that crop would come out nothing like the parent, which effectively makes seed saving pointless. Other seeds have been genetically modified to be genetically unstable, so that even when they're given the opportunity to cross with other seed, they're biologically incapable. There's some seeds farmers can only get by signing a contract that stipulates how they're allowed to use it, and that only they are allowed to possess it. which brings with it the threat of litigation against anyone found to be in possession of that proprietary genetic information outside of the contract. And of course, there's lobbying governments directly to turn that search for purity of seed into law. And at the end of that, if those strategies happen to give multinationals a monopoly over the market, well, that doesn't hurt either. And this is when we get back to that seed cycle we learned as kids. Because since people aren't saving or selecting their own seed anymore, and the companies that produce those seeds are doing their best to make sure that they never evolve and eliminate whole steps in the process, what that means is that for most intents and purposes, the seed cycle is no longer a cycle. What we've got is a straight line, where if you're a farmer growing pumpkin seeds, the line might look like this. If you're growing roses, it might look like this, and if you're growing something like kale, you get this little short nothing of a line. And that leaves us in a moment where our seeds don't really matter to us anymore, and they don't behave like seeds. What they do is push us to harm and shape the world to accommodate them if we want to eat, and where our capacity to breed better, stronger, and more resilient seeds has been mostly taken from us. And that's before we even look at how this all affects us as people. The line most people are fed these days is that the seeds we're planting are a miracle of modern ingenuity. They're an important part of the toolkit that allow for so many people to be fed by the work of so few, and that this system is what allows civilization to flourish while we can be free from having to worry about anything as trivial as having to grow our own food. And that's not wrong, but there is a dark side to the system being structured that way. Because that design of having so few people engaged in growing food creates a systemic risk. Basically, the types of seeds we're breeding, because they're so adapted to industrial agriculture, pressure us to continue centralizing farming into fewer and fewer hands. And it's just getting worse as we keep selecting for seeds that can only grow with a very particular and expensive way of farming. And that might not seem like a big issue to you because you probably don't want to farm and you like going to the supermarket to pick up your groceries. But if anything were to happen to the capacity of that small group of people to grow our food, your capacity to feed yourself would disappear, and most everyone we know would be fucked. And the truth here is that our industrial way of farming is getting riskier by the year. And all that's really keeping it going are things like access to large amounts of cheap energy to keep it running and government subsidies to keep it profitable, neither of which are guaranteed to last. And on top of that, farming like we do is actively making the earth less fertile and more degraded, which in turn drives climate change, wildlife extinctions, increasing the risk of disease in the crops, and just all around making it riskier to grow food each and every year. And if that system, which is getting more stressed by the year, should ever fail, we won't have the seeds we'll need to be able to respond to that emergency and grow our own food, because we won't be able to do it without access to those expensive and energy-rich styles of farming. At the end of the day, we are seeds. And I don't mean that as a metaphor, I mean it in a very real and direct way. Our well-being depends on seeds. Our lifestyles are only possible thanks to seeds. And quite literally, we eat them and they become us. So whenever we weaken our seeds, we're weakening ourselves. And that has a lot of negative effects. First, there's the physical effects that has on us. Like, usually the more geared towards high productivity a seed is, the less nutritious it'll become. Because what high productivity usually pushes a plant towards is growth so fast that the plant can't keep up. The plant can't gather the minerals they need fast enough to supply their whole body. They don't have enough time to develop internal structures and metabolism through the synthesis of things like vitamins or antioxidants. So that fast growth, plus land practices like tilling and the use of chemical fertilizers, actively making soil decreasingly fertile, makes it so that our food isn't as nutritious as it could be, which essentially means that the food we're trying to grow, even food we think of as healthy, is increasingly just empty calories. Then, it may seem like a stretch at first, but weakening seeds also has an effect on the ways we see, experience, and relate to the world. When we select seeds for these huge yields that don't need the direct care or influence of people, but instead push a very few of us to farm from up in our covered cabin, it isn't just creating a broad systemic risk, it's also estranging the majority of us from nature. It used to be that people had to live close to nature. They had to attune themselves to what was happening in their environments. They had to care what seeds were doing and what they needed to give them the best chance of survival. For better or worse, people grew up knowing that their lives depended on the natural world, which created a common ground where, for better or worse, we still lived with nature present in our daily lives, because we understood that whatever happens to nature happens to us too. Today, our relationship with seeds is teaching us the exact opposite. It's pushing farmers into a worldview where they believe they have to shape, manipulate, and dominate the world to grow their crop. While the rest of us are learning that no matter what happens, there's always going to be food in the supermarket. We don't need to worry about or connect with the natural world in any way. And within that context, it's increasingly easy to forget about the natural world as anything other than a tool we use to get what we want, which all serves to reinforce our individualism, because we're insulated from the consequences of our choices. There's no real feedback between how we treat the natural world and the repercussions. We're free to forget our connection to the natural world and believe that we don't need to be reliant on anyone or anything. And that affects our culture at large. Essentially, with so much of our infrastructure and civilization now dependent on this destructive and weakened system of seeds, we've started to believe in the goodness of the way we're doing things. We're so invested in this way that most of us won't ever consider other possibilities. For example, look at this vineyard. I think most people look at this landscape and think, wow, that's so rustic, it's so beautiful. When in reality, what you're looking at is the highly disturbed ecologic equivalent of a prison camp. Each vine planted in this field was only ever going to be planted in a field just like this one, irrigated in just this way, eroding the soil in just this way without a care given to how it harms the environment around them. Their one and only job being to produce as much as they can without much care given to their health. And to make sure that there's no variability between the vines, they're not even grown from seed, just taken from cuttings to make sure they're all identical. And the people who maintain these fields are basically prison guards. They're forced into taking on the role of enforcing aggression. They have to till the field a few times a year to keep the soil bare. They have to maintain what's essentially a quarantine zone where no other species are allowed to grow. They have to spray poisons a dozen times a year to make sure everything goes off without a hitch while ignoring how it's all draining right into the river. They have to organize hunting parties to kill boars in the surrounding woods. And all of that to grow a crop that has no ecologic business growing in this bioregion. And you might really like wine and shrug it off and think, that's just how it is. That's how we grow our food. But that's the point. It only seems normal to you because you've been raised in a culture where it's normal to exploit others if it serves you. You've internalized that ecologic harm is just the price we have to pay to eat. But that's just not true. There's so many other ways to grow food. There's been so many cultures who survived for thousands of years, who left the world better off than they found it. And we have the capacity and knowledge to start making it so that we don't harm the planet. But to get there, among a lot of other things, our seeds are going to have to evolve. The reality is that strong seeds are the foundation of every living society, and any society that doesn't value the vitality of their seeds is doomed to unsustainability. So we're going to need to change that. When it comes to how we strengthen our seeds, the first thing we probably need to do is accept that, as things stand, it's not going to be the giant seed producers that help us out here. Our benefit and their incentives aren't really aligned. So whatever positive changes we're going to make have to come from us as individuals or communities, which means a bottom-up approach where, as a society, we start caring about seeds. And from that place of individual responsibility, there's a few practical things we can do to make that happen, which already have a lot of good information written about them. So what I'm going to focus on here, instead of going in depth, are the starting points, so that if you do get interested in seeds, as I really hope you do, you'll know what your options are. So let's take a look at a few practical options we have for how to help strengthen our seeds. Where we source our seeds from is important, which means to the best of our ability trying to source seeds from the most ethical places we can find. Which means, to the best of our ability, staying away from seeds labeled treated, hybrid, or genetically modified. Instead, what you can do is to look for small organic producers committed to selecting or caring for local varieties. And if you can't find anything like that, then the best next step would be to look for seed catalogs that provide heirloom seeds. In general, though, just be on the lookout for sources that say open or cross-pollinated. And whatever you pick, pay special attention to selecting varieties that are as closely suited to your land and climate as you can find. The most important thing you can do here, though, and this goes for anyone getting any seed for the first time, is to just be curious. If you got them from a friend, ask your friend where they got their seeds. If you get them from a supplier, ask what methods they use in growing and selecting those seeds. If you've got the time, see what else you can find out. See if you can get to know the seed's stories and history. Just like with people, understanding a seed's past helps us understand and care for those seeds today. So, how were they selected before they were grown? What were they originally selected for? What part of the world did they come from, and how did they make their way to you? Were they stolen from indigenous populations? Are they from mountains? What does their genetic past tell you about what they need from an ecosystem in the present? All of those will help you connect to your seeds and help you understand what they're capable of, what they're not, and will provide you with a set of guidelines for the kind of care they'll need. Then there's saving seed, which is the most important step, because it gets us to start getting back to that old seed cycle as we have to see the process through from beginning to end. And what that looks like, if what we want to plant are some heirloom seeds, for example, is exactly what you'd expect. You'd plant enough seed to have them cross-pollinate, and then allow enough of those plants to go to seed to be able to harvest some for next year. And through that process, you might be able to select for some characteristics you enjoy, like thin skin, early or late fruiting, or 1,000 other traits. But in general, what people are usually looking for through this process is finding seeds that are true to type, where true to type means that the main goal is to try and select seeds so that next year's plants will grow pretty similarly to the way the parent plants grew this year. What people are looking for most of the time is constancy through generations, so that when a recipe calls for something like aroma tomato, they know that's what they'll have. And there's a lot of resources here for how to save seeds like this. In fact, most books about seeds these days are about this style of saving seed, so I won't go into much detail. But what I want to say is that there's a pretty large drawback to only doing things like this. And that's that it doesn't actually help seeds get much stronger, because essentially we're still searching for that purity, which, as we know, has its problems. Here, what we need to understand is that heirloom seeds from 100 years ago are not the same as the heirlooms we have with us today, because seeds aren't gold. You can't keep them in a box somewhere and expect them not to change. What happens in practice, when all we're trying to do is maintain our seeds consistent through generations, is that we're crossing heirlooms to heirlooms, which means that most of the time the population size is too small, which means that with every passing generation, the gene pool is shrinking. So, hidden from view, even though the tomato looks the same, you're accidentally losing beneficial traits. Traits that might otherwise be giving plants the capacity to survive moments of stress, disease, or climatic transition. So after too many generations of saving seed like that, what we're left with is an heirloom that looks like the seeds our grandparents had, but are actually substantially weaker. So if you're genuinely interested in strengthening seeds, what you need to do is to try and breed new varieties. If what you want is to find those good, strong seeds, seeds that are locally adapted, naturally resistant to pests and diseases, and have a much richer genetic diversity capable of weathering changing ecologic conditions, while at the same time still retaining all of the flavors and beneficial traits we expect, then the only way we're going to get there is by breeding new varieties of seed. And in order to do that, what we'll need to do is to get back to that original relationship people had with seeds, where our main priority is finding the best and strongest seeds, not the seeds that provide us with the least work. And if you're interested in that, then looking for resources about breeding your own vegetables or breeding landrace seeds might be the best direction for you to go. In a nutshell, what modern breeders are trying to do is to reintroduce as much of that missing genetic variability that's been lost from our seed as possible. And they do that by gathering as many different varieties of seed as they can find, sometimes even reintroducing older wild varieties and then mixing them all together. The hope being that they'll recombine into new crosses much more resilient than their parents. Essentially looking for seeds that will do better in whatever the ecologic conditions where they're growing are, whether that be poor soil or less water. They're looking for seeds that are more nutritious, more flavorful, more resistant to disease or slugs, and they're trying to combine all those beneficial traits distributed out among all the different seeds into a single seed. Now keep in mind that breeding seed like this is much harder and substantially more work than just saving seed. With so much more genetic material, it requires a lot more effort and time. There's a lot of failed trials, meticulous hands-on observation, and there can be generations of crossing before you actually find those few plants that have the particular traits you are looking for. But at the same time, it's the absolute best method we have available to us for strengthening our seed. Okay, those are some of the direct changes we can make for our seeds. But there's the cultural changes we can make too, things that would indirectly help strengthen seeds. The easiest thing for us to do, especially if we can't grow seeds ourselves, is to expand our kitchen. We've all probably heard that the majority of humanity's diet is only about 20 plants, which is crazy because when you think about it, that means that the majority of the world's ecosystems are made up of just 20 plants. When we're supposed to be routinely eating at least a few hundred plants, and there should be something like a few thousand growing in the wilds that we recognize and occasionally eat. Eating a wider diet puts a good pressure on us, not just to improve the biodiversity of our ecosystems, but also to plant a wider variety of seeds than we usually would. So here what we can do is not just go for the foods and varieties we're used to, but see how far we can stretch our cooking. Try cooking with species you've never eaten before. Look for lesser known varieties of foods you've eaten your whole life. Open up to the possibility of eating parts of plants you wouldn't usually think to eat. Corn, for example. We think that all that's edible are the kernels, so we've selected our corn to have the largest possible ears, again to maximize yield. But so many more parts of corn are edible than we realize, from the young shoots, to the leaves, to the baby corn, to the tassels and silk. They're all edible. And in theory, there's no reason we couldn't be selecting different seeds for each one of those. Something else we can do is to share our seeds. As much as possible, take money out of the equation and pass them along. Seeds need to be planted and shared to be rejuvenated. They're not doing anything in your cupboard. Because the real challenge when it comes to seeds is that they're a continuous generational process. You can't buy or breed seeds that are useful today and then hang up your hat for the rest of time. Every year that passes makes those seeds less likely to germinate. And every year your seed population isn't crossing with someone else's, a few more genes are being lost. So the more we pass those seeds around, the better the chances will be that someone's breeding will find those new varieties we need. Finally, even if you don't have seeds to share, you can share what you know. Talk to your friends, kids, strangers about how important seeds are. Don't let people forget that our lives depend on seeds. Teach people how to breed new varieties. Introduce them to a generational long view where each of us is just a link in a long chain that goes backward and forward in an unthinkable amount of time. Advocate for seeds. Raise their profile, whether that's through talking about them or making overly long videos on YouTube. Here the goal is to bring seeds back into daily life, and not just to feed ourselves, but to distribute that responsibility to strengthen our seeds, and to remind ourselves that for as long as we don't care for our seeds, we don't care for our future. If you haven't pieced it together yet, I really think that changing our relationship with something as small as seeds can have a profound change in the way we relate to the world. I think there's a lot of hidden benefits and potential here, especially if you're looking at the other side of those risks and challenges we talked about earlier. First is the obvious. Stronger seeds would lead to a more resilient society. The way it's looking now, what the future has in store for us is a reckoning on a scale we've never faced before. And without the right seeds, for most of us, there just isn't going to be any way through the weirding. So given that we've never faced anything like this, we've got to remember that plants have. Tucked away in the genetic memory of most healthy seeds are millions of years of disturbances. There's moments of much higher carbon in the atmosphere, hotter periods, ice ages, and within the genome of most plants is the capacity to weather and adapt to calamity. And I'm not saying any plant can be adapted to any condition, but the fact is that the better we are at helping our seeds unlock those dormant genes and traits, the more resilient we'll be when shit hits the fan. Because a lot of the genetic information we need is around, but it's distributed in a million different places, in small pockets and the gardens of amateur seed breeders, which means that there is potential for resilience if we start breeding seeds uniquely suited to our particular ecologic conditions now. If we get skilled enough at helping our seeds get back to behaving like seeds, then we have a chance of navigating whatever climate weirding comes our way. Then there's the other side of those personal risks that weak seeds bring into our lives that we talked about before. If the state of our seeds and the agricultural ramifications leave us feeling estranged from nature, then strengthening our relationship to seeds can mean changing the ways we interact with nature, helping us reconnect with nature. I think there's a natural shift that can happen in people when they take some time to be with seeds. In the same way that inventing something like computers leads to a more sedentary lifestyle with all kinds of different effects on us, changing our relationship with seeds and taking time to be with them also has its effects. Because learning to grow healthy and strong seeds doesn't just help seeds, it helps us develop some pretty important characteristics. It means a more active interaction with land, which means more time in nature. It means you're going to have to develop your capacity for observation, enough to notice minor differences in the traits of seemingly identical plants as they grow. You're going to have to learn patience and how to be nurturing enough to grow and select generations of plants over the course of years or maybe even your whole lifetime. You're going to have to be open-minded enough to be curious about the ways that nature works instead of the ways we want nature to work. Essentially, our relationship to healthy seeds teaches us how to be good, caring people. Because seeds need the same things to thrive that people need. They need space to grow, some guidance instead of control. They need to be fed, nurtured, and loved. And moving beyond just the practical traits that would bring out in us, there's also something inspiring about the way that seeds evolve that can affect how we look at all of our relationships. If you can stop looking at seeds as just inert packets of information that grow our food, and instead start looking at them like living beings with their own strengths, weaknesses, stories, potential, and ways of doing things, then you can start to see them as role models. Because they understand some things that we don't. They understand the order of nature and abide by that order. And they're teaching us healthier strategies for how to interact with the world. For example, seeds don't actively try to shape the world to their own liking and benefit. What they do is become the parts of themselves that the world needs. In dry climate, for example, they let their drought tolerance come out. Over time, seeds give preference to those traits that are best suited to their environment. They don't try to hold on to some old form of life in which they were necessary and strong, and they don't try to build a utopia that suits them. Instead, what healthy seeds do is adapt. They allow themselves to die, to change, and grow back to meet the world as it is. And they do that by feeding on the literal shit they have around them to transform their world into something more beautiful, relational, and alive. And their small acts end up having a cascade of positive effect. And imagine if we did that, if we stopped infantilizing ourselves by shaping the world to keep everything easy and comfortable for ourselves. If we stopped raising kids like seeds selected on just a few biased traits as we hold the world still for them, and instead we focused on rediscovering the parts of ourselves best suited to handling the challenges of living in a complex and changing world. Finally, strengthening seeds can help reshape society as a whole. Because what we're doing right now is treating ourselves just like we treat modern seeds. We're reshaping everything to fit our frailty and extracting whatever we can in the process from the natural world to maintain these artificial bubbles of individuality. And what that does is harm the planet in order to keep ourselves isolated while inflicting pain on each other. And it's so hard to get away from that. But I think strengthening seeds helps us grow towards being a society that's actually worth being a part of, that doesn't do those things. Because what it could do is slowly help wean us off industrial agriculture, as the increased strength of our seed helps pick up the slack for whatever we lose in production, which could help us relearn how to relate to the natural world from a place of care and connection instead of exploitation, and connect us to a heritage of people who've cared for these seeds for thousands of years. And I think there's a powerful medicine in that kind of society, where our actions can actually help the world become wilder, society become more sustainable, and people feel a bit of joy. Because by remembering that our lives are only possible thanks to seed, we connect with seed. And just like our evolving seeds, we can grow content living with substantially less than what we have now. And I do understand that it's very likely that I'll die before I get to see that happen, because these things take time. But I also think that that's what it means to be a seed. You grow, root, flower, and finally die into the earth in such a way that, hopefully, whatever comes next is better suited to supporting life than the current state of affairs.